current events in Syria. So what we want to do tonight is look at a number of Bible prophecies which concern Syria, see where Syria fits into the picture in the last days, and have a look at what's happening in our newspapers today and see why this is significant. Now, the reason for this Bible education evening is really generated from a Tuesday night seminar that I did just a couple of weeks ago now. And doing that seminar, I was really impressed by two things. I was reviewing details of last day prophecies. I also looked at the weekly World Watches and saw some material Brother Andy Walton prepared on Syria. And it's apparent that Syria is a critical component in the events leading up to Jesus Christ's appearing and return, an extremely significant sign of the times for us. And the second thing that was impressed upon me is that events are moving extremely rapidly in the Middle East, and a conflict that involves Israel seems very close in the near future. So from looking at these things, I've been genuinely excited at the nearness of Christ's appearing. And I wanted to share with you tonight some of the details of the events that occur leading up to this. So before we look at Syria, I wanted to spend some time looking at some background and some prophecies. So this is what I want to cover tonight. First of all, we want to look in a bit more detail at the appearing of Jesus Christ. Then we'll look at the conflicts at Jerusalem, and we'll see how Syria is involved, and finish with looking at what's happening in Syria today and see how things are heating up and the tensions that are present. So there's quite a lot of background I want to look at first before we look at the actual events in Syria. So let's start by looking at Jesus appearing. Now, the first question is there a difference between the appearing of Jesus and the return of Jesus? Now, I want to answer that question first. So the first passage I want to look at is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and I've put that on the screen for you because we're all very familiar with this chapter. So the context of the chapter is Paul is telling the Thessalonians what happens to those who have fallen asleep in Christ. He explains the role of those who have died in Christ when Jesus Christ returns and how they fit in. And so he gives us a summary of events. And he says, "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God. And the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so shall we ever be with the Lord." So just breaking that down, first of all, Jesus descends from heaven. Then there's this call of command, the archangel's voice, the trumpet. And following that, the dead rise. And the dead rise first, we're told quite specifically. Then the living are caught up, or as it means, caught away. And they're gathered in the clouds or the air, whatever that refers to meet Jesus. So we're quite familiar with those words. Now, if we turn to Matthew chapter 24, we're given a little bit more information. So Matthew chapter 24 is the Olivet prophecy. So the context of Matthew 24 is the disciples asking Jesus about the end of the world and when that would occur. And as part of Jesus' response, we'll pick this up in verse 27. It says, "For as lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." So we've got this picture of lightning across the heavens. That's what Christ's appearing is going to be like. It's going to be very obvious what is happening. Now, it goes on to talk about eagles gathering to a carcass. We'll come back to that in just a moment. So we keep going in verse 30. These are the events that Jesus describes when the Son of Man appears. "Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn." Now, the mourning of all the tribes of the earth, that's not mentioned in Thessalonians chapter 4. So why are they mourning? They're mourning because of the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And if we keep reading, we find out what that is. "They shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So what is the sign of the Son of Man in heaven? It is Jesus coming in the clouds with power and great glory. So this is the appearing of Jesus Christ, and he appears to the world, and the world responds by mourning. But is this Jesus Christ's return to the earth physically? Well, we know that when Jesus Christ returns to the earth, he comes to the Mount of Olives, Acts 1 verse 11. And we know that when Jesus returns to the earth, the saints are with him, in Zechariah chapter 14. Now, when we read this verse, it says that Jesus comes with the clouds. And we might think, well, perhaps the clouds there is a symbol of the saints who have come with Jesus. But it's not the case. If we keep reading, and he shall send his angels, and there will be the sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather his elect from the four winds, from the one end of heaven to the other. So the saints haven't been gathered yet until the end of verse 31. And from Thessalonians, we know that the trumpet occurs, then the dead are raised, and then the saints are gathered. So we have this situation where the Son of Man appears in the heavens in glory. And then we have the trumpet, and then we have the gathering, the dead are raised, and the gathering of the saints. And so what is the clouds in verse 30 then? Well, perhaps this is quite literal, and it's the sign of the Son of Man, and there's this glorious display of power and glory in the heavens or in the clouds. Now, where are the saints actually gathered to? Well, we know quite specifically where they end up, and that is the Mount of Olives. And that is hinted at here in this chapter. But it's also we're also told that in Luke 17, where the disciples, Christ is discussing the events of the return of Christ, and he speaks about people who are doing the same occupation, but one is gathered and one is left. And so picking up that context in Luke 17, 2 men shall be in the field, one shall be taken and the other left. And here's the question of the disciples, where, Lord? They're saying, where are the saints being gathered to? And Jesus' answer, wheresoever the body is, thither will the eagles be gathered together. So we have this almost cryptic response that the saints are being gathered to where the body is. So the eagles are representing the saints, and they're being gathered to the body. Now it's the same as in Matthew 24 verse 28. Wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. So where are the saints being gathered to? Well, at the time of the end, where would you be most likely to find a body or a carcass? Right in the centre of Armageddon. We know that the city of Jerusalem will be the centre point of conflict for all nations. And we also know independently from Zechariah that the saints do gather at the Mount of Olives when they return with Christ. And so in Jerusalem there'll be the shattered remnants of the nation of Israel, and it will be the location where all the nations of the world have gathered. Now, just looking at, there's a number of passages from the Olivet prophecy and a few other places that I've put together here. But I think that the same pattern is reflected. So essentially what we see is initially there is the appearing of Jesus Christ. There's the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and it's going to be unmistakable. We'll know specifically that this is Jesus Christ. It'll be like lightning flashing across the heavens. Every eye will see him, and there'll be chaos and confusion for some. We see here that the earth will react with mourning and wailing. There'll be fear and confusion. Then there's the call of command. Jesus sends his angels, there's the voice of the archangel, and the dead are raised following the trumpet blast. And then those who are alive and remain, as Thessalonians 4 says, those who are alive and remain will be gathered together, and there's some form of judgment where some are taken and some are left. And they go to meet Christ. And so after that judgment has taken place, and possibly after a bit of a time gap, we know that the saints end up in Jerusalem in the middle of the battle of Armageddon, and they defeat the forces of Gog as Christ and the saints descend on the Mount of Olives. So I guess the point of looking at this is to bring out the fact that Christ first appears to the world in glory, and there's a response from the world, the saints are gathered, and then later he physically returns to the earth with the saints. So now what I want to do is look at our reading in Zechariah and use this to see how this all fits together. So if you come to Zechariah chapter 12, our reading tonight. So I want to look at both Zechariah 12 and Zechariah 14. And we don't have time to go through all the details here, but I want to just ask a couple of questions and see what these chapters are telling us. So we know we've got this conflict over Jerusalem. So if we first look at Zechariah chapter 12, and we ask the question, well, who does this involve? Verse 2, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. In verse 6, in that day I will make the governors of Judah like a hearth of fire among the wood, and like a torch of fire in the sheaf. And they shall devour all the people round about, on the right hand and on the left. So we have this description, the people round about. And if you have a closer look at these words, the word people means tribes, and roundabout has the idea of encircling or encompassing, the idea of a neighbour or someone that is on every side. So Zechariah is talking about the people roundabout, those immediately surrounding Israel. And what is their focus? Verse 2, Jerusalem is a cup of trembling. The siege is at Jerusalem. Verse 3, in that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone. So the focus here for this conflict is at Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the prize. And what is the outcome of this conflict? Well, at the end of verse 6 it says, and Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place, even in Jerusalem. Now, if you read the RSV and many other versions, it says, while Jerusalem shall still be inhabited in its place. Rotherham says, so shall Jerusalem yet be inhabited in her own place. So Jerusalem is not lost in this first conflict. It remains inhabited. Now, the outcome of the battle is that Israel's enemies are destroyed. And we see that in verse 4, that every horse and rider is struck with astonishment and blindness. Verse 6, that the governors of Judah are like a fire among a wood. And verse 8, we read the inhabitants of Jerusalem, they also fight. And the feeble will be like David, who was Israel's renowned warrior. And those of the house of David, or the warriors who were warriors already, will be as God, it says, and the angel of Yahweh before them. So it's the inhabitants of Jerusalem and it's the governors of Judah who fight with God's power here. All right, when we look at Zechariah chapter 14 and we ask these same questions, first of all, who is involved in the conflict in Zechariah 14? Verse 2, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem. Now this is a different word that's used to describe the people who are attacking. The word there is foreign nations or Gentile nations. So this is not the people round about or the neighbours of Israel. What's the focus in Zechariah 14? Well, yes, it's still centred on Jerusalem, but verse 1, the day of Yahweh cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. So it's the same location, but the focus is on spoil, similar to what we see in Ezekiel 38. And what's the outcome? Again, verse 2, I'll gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, The houses rifled, the women ravished, and half the city shall go forth into captivity. So the city is definitely taken here in Zechariah 14. And we saw that it was yet inhabited in chapter 12. Now the outcome, Israel's enemies are destroyed in this situation as well, but under different circumstances. So in verse 4 we have Christ on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives splits and there's this massive earthquake. In verse 12 we have a plague that eats away the flesh of the people. In verse 13 we have those nations fighting against each other. So when we put these two chapters together, rather than seeing one conflict that's all centred on Jerusalem, we have here described two separate conflicts. The first conflict is involving Israel's immediately surrounding neighbours, and the second conflict is involving all nations, Gentile nations, attacking at Jerusalem as well. In the first conflict, Jerusalem remains in the hands of Israel. In the second, Jerusalem is taken. Okay, now how does this all fit with the picture we saw of the details at Christ's return? We've got an interesting hint if we go back to chapter 12 and verse 10. So it says there, "I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplications. And they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn." So after this conflict, we have those inhabitants of Jerusalem, they see him whom they have pierced. They see Christ, and their response is mourning. Mourning with such bitterness that it goes on for a couple of verses to describe the depth of their mourning there. Now, where else have we read about the world seeing Jesus and mourning? Well, that's exactly the pattern we've already seen when the sign of the Son of Man appears in heaven, and the world responds in mourning. Now, you might say, well, this section in Zechariah is specific to Israel. Is this just talking about Israel, and does Israel mourn at the same time as the rest of the world? Well, yes. If we look in Revelation 1 verse 7, it says, "Behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him." So we have Israel and the rest of the world mourning at the same time and for the same reason. So I think the picture goes something like this. We've got this battle in Zechariah chapter 12, and it involves the nations immediately surrounding Israel. And the way this battle goes is that Israel are certain to be annihilated, but God is working for them. Now, there's nothing overt in these verses. You don't see Christ and the saints destroying their enemies. You don't see natural disasters. Their enemies are astonished and blinded. Now, perhaps that was a loss of communications. The governors fight like flames in dry kindling. The inhabitants of Jerusalem also fight with God's power. They're fighting with the strength of David, a mighty warrior. So Israel come through this battle, and they have this great victory that they should never have won, humanly speaking. And they survey the aftermath in wonder, most likely. And then they see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, as Jesus is revealed to them and to the world. And so all of a sudden they see their Messiah. They see him in great detail, and everything clicks into place. And like the rest of the world, their response is to mourn. Why would they mourn? Well, of all people, they had a unique opportunity. They were God's chosen people, and they didn't take advantage of it. And all of a sudden, their history would make sense to them. But they would also realise the predicament they were in because they have not obeyed or followed their God. And so, as I said, the same thing would be happening all over the globe. The moment Christ appears, our opportunity for change has finished. And for those who knew him, or for those who have forsaken him, it will be a time of desperate mourning and bitterness, just like we have described here of Israel, because of the wasted opportunity. Now, of course, the faithful won't be in that case, and they will be preparing to meet Jesus. But as I said, Israel would realise the predicament they are in for ignoring their God. And so we're told that their troubles are not over. In chapter 13, verse 9, it's described to us that they still have to go through the fire. Their judgment is not over. They need to be refined like gold and like silver until they can truly say, Yahweh is my God. And so that's when we have chapter 14. And here and as we said earlier, there's possibly a bit of a time gap here for the nations to recover. And then war breaks out in Jerusalem as Gog and the Confederacy of Ezekiel 38 invade into the nation of Israel. And so the next critical step comes in verse 4 of Zechariah chapter 14, where it says, "And his feet shall stand in that day on the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof towards the east and towards the west." So this is Christ's return to the Mount of Olives, as it's told to us in Acts chapter 1. "But with him are the saints." Look at the end of verse 5. "And Yahweh my God shall come, and all the saints with thee." So when Christ returns in verse 4, he's coming with the saints to the Mount of Olives. So we have these two conflicts in Zechariah chapter 14. And these events really frame the appearing and the return of Jesus Christ. So at the end of this first conflict involving the nations surrounding Israel, we have the appearing of Christ, and the world responds in mourning, and Christ then gathers the saints. And then this conflict, as the saints are judged, this conflict breaks out in Jerusalem for the second time, involving now all nations, not just the nations immediately surrounding Israel. And it's during that conflict that Christ and the saints return to the earth physically to save the nations of Israel. Okay, now we're talking about Syria tonight. So what I want to do is have a closer look at this first conflict and see some more of the details here. Now, we've said that this involves the people round about, which refers to the neighbours, those immediately neighbouring on Israel. But if we come to Psalm chapter 83, we find a little bit more detail, and I think this fits in to Zechariah chapter 12. So in Psalm 83, we have a description of a confederacy of nations, and their intent is to destroy Israel. So it says in verse 4, "Come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent, they are confederate against thee." And it goes on to describe 10 separate nations who are joined together in this ambition. Now, the interesting thing about Psalm 83 is that this group of nations, there's never been an invasion of Israel with this group of nations with the outcome that is described at the end of this chapter. And when we look at these nations, they fit the description of Zechariah 12 very well. They're immediately surrounding the nation of Israel. And so that on the screen is where those 10 nations are at the time when this psalm was written. But essentially we're describing Israel's neighbours, places like Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and also in Jordan as well. Now the interesting thing in Psalm 83 is their motive isn't just to destroy Israel. Look at verse 12. "Who said, let us take ourselves the houses of God in possession. So what is their motive? What's underlying this confederacy here? It's the house of God. They're aiming for Jerusalem, just like Zechariah 12. And what happens? Verse 13, O my God, make them like a wheel as stubble before the wind, as the fire burneth the wood, and as the flame setteth the mountains on fire. Now, if you were listening when we read verse 6 of Zechariah 12, you'll notice that that's exactly the same language that is used in the destruction of their enemies there. And so the outcome of this battle from verse 9 to 11 is the same as the outcome from the battle with the Midianites, with Sisera, with Oreb and Zeb. Basically, total destruction, the total removal of that threat. And the end result is the shame and destruction of these nations, and those nations actually turning to God. So in the end, verse 18, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Yahweh, art the most high over all the earth. So that is the outcome which we have not seen in history. Now turn to Ezekiel chapter 28 because we're given some interesting detail here as well. Now the context of Ezekiel 28 from verse 22 is judgment against Zidon. And Zidon is of course in the area of Lebanon. But it goes on to say, Ezekiel 28 verse 24, and there shall be no more a pricking briar unto the house of Israel, nor any grievous thorn of all that are round about them that despise them, and they shall know that I am Yahweh their God. So it says here there will be no more a pricking briar, and then it describes to us what that is. Those who are round about them that despise them. Now that's a perfect description of Israel's neighbours. And this verse says that those pricking briars will be removed. But when will this happen? Verse 25. Thus saith Adonai Yahweh, when I shall have gathered the house of Israel from the people among whom they were scattered, and shall be sanctified in them in the sight of the heathen, then shall they dwell in their land that I have given to my servant Jacob. So this occurs after Israel have been gathered, or after they've been scattered and then regathered. So this is talking about the latter days. It's the time when Israel are back in their land. And so what is the status of Israel after the removal of these pricking briars? Verse 26, and they shall dwell safely therein, and they shall build houses and plant vineyards. Yea, they shall dwell with confidence when I have executed judgments upon all those that despise them round about them. And they shall know that I am Yahweh their God. So we have there another description of the removal of these neighbouring nations around Israel, a conflict of those round about. And it looks here that Israel come through that and they're dwelling safely, they're planting vineyards, and everything is going well. I want to look at one more passage which describes this conflict, which shows that Israel don't come through this unscathed. So turn to Isaiah chapter 17. So Isaiah chapter 17 and verse 1. So it says the burden of Damascus. So this is the judgment on Damascus or the judgment on Syria. So the burden of Damascus. Behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap. Now that's a very interesting statement in this prophecy, because if we look up Damascus, we find that it's described as the oldest continuously inhabited city of the world. So this has never occurred. The complete destruction of Damascus has never occurred. And RSV quite specifically says that it will cease to be a city. So Isaiah is saying, first of all, that Damascus is going to be destroyed. So this is still to happen. And this fits in with Zechariah chapter 12, and we'll see that as we go through. Verse 2, what else happens? The cities of Aroah are forsaken. They shall be for flocks, which shall lie down, and none shall make them afraid. Now, the cities of Aroah are actually in Jordan. So Damascus is destroyed, and the city in Jordan is destroyed, and so much so that flocks are going to be there, and they're not going to be disturbed or frightened. So basically, there's no one there to frighten them. It's desolate. Verse 3, the fortress also shall cease from Ephraim. And we know Ephraim is the northern part of Israel. So the fortress shall cease from Ephraim and the kingdom of Damascus and the remnant of Syria. And they shall be as the glory of the children of Israel, saith Yahweh of hosts. So the defences in Ephraim, in northern Israel, are brought down. And in verse 4, in that day it shall come to pass that the glory of Jacob shall be made thin, and the fatness of his flesh shall wax lean. And it shall be as when the harvestman gathereth corn, and reapeth the ears with his arm. And it shall be as he that gathereth ears in the valley of Rephaim. So here we have a description of Ephraim, of northern Israel. And it says it's like a cornfield after it's been harvested. So complete destruction. And we've got a picture there in the background showing what a harvested cornfield looks like. But we know that they are victorious. And verse 6 says, yet gleaning grapes shall be left in it, as the shaking of an olive tree, 2 or 3 berries in the top of the utmost bough, 4 or 5 in the outermost branches thereof, saith Adonai Yahweh of Israel. So there's this destruction that extends into Israel, but they are not destroyed. They are victorious, but only barely. And so there's a few grapes left from the harvest. There's a few olives left in the trees, which describes the small portion of strength that remains in the nation of Israel after this conflict. Verse 7, at that day shall a man look to his Maker, and his eyes shall have respect to the Holy One of Israel. Now, why at this point, after going through this destruction, would Israel look to their Maker? Well, perhaps there's the appearing of the Son of Man in heaven, which causes them to again consider their position and seek God. Now, we saw in Ezekiel 28, though, that Israel were flourishing and they were at peace. So how does this occur? Well, in verse 11, we read this. And we're still talking about Israel in terms of a plant or a harvest, if you like. In that day shall thou make thy plant to grow, and in the morning shall they make thy seed to flourish. But the harvest shall be a heap in the day of grief and of desperate sorrow. Now, the language there is a little bit tricky to understand, but the RSV basically says, though you make them grow on the day that you plant them, and make them blossom in the morning that you sow, yet harvest will flee away in a day of grief and incurable pain. So what we've got here is a picture of Israel. There's a few olives left. There's a remnant of Israel that survives, and as a plant, they start to grow again. In fact, they start to flourish. But, says God, the harvest never comes. They don't flourish to a point when they're bearing fruit. They start to recover. As Ezekiel 28 says, they're in peace and they're in confidence, but it's short-lived. And that's because there's a second conflict. Verse 12, woe to the multitude of many people, which make a noise like the noise of the sea, and to the rushing of nations, that make a rushing like the rushing of mighty waters. The nations shall rush like the rushing of many waters. Look at the language here. We've got this picture of this small plant it's survived, it's growing, it's starting to flourish again, and then the nations come in for the second time, and they're rushing. Nation after nation are rushing in to the place where this small plant has started to grow again. Now, the language there will most probably remind us of Ezekiel chapter 38. So let's finish this story in Ezekiel 38 and see how this ends. Now, I'm not going to spend any time looking at the Confederacy here of Ezekiel 38. We're very familiar with the first 7 verses which describe Gog and his Confederacy. So we'll pick this story up in verse 8. After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come back into the land that is brought back from the sword. Now, interestingly enough, RSV and many other translations actually translate that as the land that is recovered from war, which is interesting in the context of the first conflict. And it says, and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have always been waste, but is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Why are they dwelling safely? Ezekiel 28 tells us the pricking briars, or their enemies round about that despise them, are removed. Verse 9, thou shalt ascend and come like a storm, thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands, and many people with thee. Thus saith Adonai Yahweh, it shall come to pass that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. Now, what's this evil thought? Verse 11, thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. Why are they unwalled? Because the fortress of Ephraim are destroyed. And I'll go to them who are at rest. Why are they at rest? Because Ezekiel 28 tells us that the pricking briars, their enemies which despise them, are removed. And it's emphasised over and over again. That dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, having neither bars nor gates. So this is a country that is completely defenceless. They have no defence, they have no strength left. That is what Gog here is invading. And why is he doing it? To take a spoil and to take a prey. That is his motive in this situation. So basically, after this first conflict, there's this great void, there's this great vacuum of power in the Middle East. Israel barely survived. The nations surrounding them have been devastated in this battle. And Russia, who incidentally are now set up in Syria right on the border, are in the perfect position to take advantage of that power vacuum. And so we have this vacuum of power in one of the richest areas of the world in terms of resources. And so Gog takes the opportunity, and it's to take a spoil and to take a prey on this defenceless area. Now, interestingly enough, just as we're looking at this, if we look at the nations in Ezekiel 38, this is generally the picture that we put up involving those nations. And you'll notice that there's this ring around Israel of nations who aren't involved in the conflict. Now, if there's any nations today who would be on board with attacking Israel and joining Russia in this confederacy, you would think it would be the neighbours of Israel who have a long-standing hatred there. But they're not involved in this second conflict. And the reason for that is that they have already been dealt with in the first conflict. All right, so in the time we've got left, we want to use this picture that we've built up tonight to have a look at what's happening in the Middle East and in Syria and see just how close we are to this first conflict. And this is highly significant because this first conflict is going to trigger the appearing of Jesus Christ in the heavens. It's going to trigger the mourning of all nations of the world, and it's going to trigger the gathering of the saints. Now, I'm sure you're aware that there's been some conflict in Syria in the last years. In fact, it's been over 7 years that Syria has been in conflict, ever since the uprisings of the Arab Spring. Now, essentially, we don't have time to go into what's happening in Syria. In fact, it's pretty hard to work out exactly what's going on in Syria. But essentially, we've got the Syrian government led by Bashar al-Assad, who cracked down on some peaceful protests very brutally and sparked this civil war. And so we had this conflict between the Syrian government and the Syrian rebels, or the Free Syrian Army. Now, that's bad enough, but the problem that occurred, and the reason this has gone on so long, is that a few other nations thought that they would also like to be involved. And this is just a bit of a snapshot. This is not all of them by any way, but nations and other extremists have now joined Syria and joined the conflict, including ISIS. And the problem in Syria is that there's many proxy wars going on. So there's this conflict and civil war in Syria, and so other nations bring their conflicts and fight it out in Syria as well. So, for example, Iran and Saudi Arabia have always been rivals, and so when this conflict breaks out, Iran supports the government, Saudi Arabia supports the rebels. Russia is strongly supporting the government. The US and NATO are supporting the rebels. But in the mix as well, we have Iran and Hezbollah who are at conflict with Israel. And so there's airstrikes from Israel. And just to mix it up a bit more, the Turkish and the Kurds are also at war. And this is all mixed in to one nation. And I mean, the situation there is unsolvable. And the type of destruction that is occurring is phenomenal. And it's causing refugees, it's destabilising Europe even, just from what's going on in this country. And I'm not sure how well you can see that, but that just shows some of the different parties in Syria at the moment. And it does seem that the Syrian government, backed by Russia, is really kind of controlling this region now. And it seems like that's how this conflict is going to go. But the area we're interested in terms of what we've seen tonight, is Israel and the conflict with the surrounding nations. And that's certainly what this events in Syria are bringing out. So we're getting headlines with titles like this: Israel versus Iran, are they heading for a war? Pretty significant. So for years, Iran have attempted to smuggle in weapons to the Hezbollah, who are on the border with Israel, to spark conflict. But now, with all the fighting that's going on in Syria, Iran have come in, they're backing the Syrian government, but they're also entrenching themselves along the northern border of Israel. And so this article goes on to say that there's skirmishes between Iran, who are based in Syria, and Israel. So much so that Iran and Israel remain on a collision course, it tells us. But there are many articles which describe a similar thing. Israel and Iran, winds of war in Jerusalem. And the interesting thing about this article, it says that Iran have the ability to spark up not only the Hezbollah, but the Hamas as well. So that's talking about parties in Lebanon, parties in the Gaza Strip as well. So this is starting to connect multiple nations around Israel. And it's not just positioning that we're talking about. There's been some serious conflict here already between Israel and Iran in Syria. Israel are essentially trying to get Iran out of Syria. But going back a couple of months, there was an Iranian drone with explosives that entered into Israel, into Israeli airspace, and that drone was shot down. Israel then retaliated to that. They sent 12 airstrikes into Syria, 8 at Syrian targets, 4 at Iranian targets in Syria, and they were trying to prevent further attacks. But the problem is weapons from Iran are coming into Syria, and Israel lost one of their fighter jets in the process. It was shot down with these air defence systems. And so, of course, then Israel retaliated again, and they went in, and they've been keeping an eye on Iran's air defence power in Syria. And so they went in and they attacked all of these missile defence systems that Iran are bringing in. So you can see this conflict is being sparked, and it's growing and growing. But it doesn't end there. Iran sent 40 rockets into northern Israel, And that triggered Israel to launch the biggest operation they've triggered in over 40 years. And they hit 50 different targets in Syria. And again, they're trying to stop Syria from attacking them. And so they hit intelligence sites, military compounds, weapons storage, military posts, and they also attacked 5 of the defence batteries that Iran have set up. So there's some pretty serious conflict going on here. And as fighting with the rebels in Syria kind of is starting to draw to a close as the government is spreading its influence, the fighting's getting closer and closer to the border of Israel. So Israel are on high alert because they're worried that this conflict could spread into their country. So they're currently only 60 kilometres from the border and moving south. There's just a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about and some articles that I wanted to bring up. If we move kind of to the west, there's also trouble with the Hezbollah. And if I had the article there, basically the leader of the Hezbollah has directly threatened Israel, saying that the day of the Great War is coming. Yeah, the Hezbollah leader has said that the day of the Great War is coming. They said they've got nothing against the Jews so long as they get out of the land of Israel. They're happy for them to live, they just don't want them in the land of Israel, which is never going to happen. They said, if you insist on occupation, the day of the Great War is coming, the day we all pray in Jerusalem. We will not give up Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Palestine, and the right of return, despite all outside pressures. So some pretty significant words coming from the leader of the Hezbollah as well. They're threatening Israel with war, and they're set their focus on Jerusalem, just like we would expect. Israel are ramping up. They're doing large-scale military exercises in the Golan Heights. They're preparing for war. But there's also been movement on the Gaza Strip as well. There's threats of war breaking out on the Gaza Strip as well. And the Prime Minister has warned them that prolonged military campaign in the area will continue until they've basically blocked all the tunnels that the Palestinians are digging under their walls. And interestingly enough, Iran's leader have said that they have to, they've denounced Israel and urged Muslims to arm Palestinians to enable them to counter what is termed genocide, which is basically Israel. So Iran are getting involved down in the Gaza Strip as well. And just last weekend, on the 15th of July, there were significant airstrikes in Gaza. Over 200 projectiles were fired from the Gaza Strip into Israel, and Israel again responded as they typically do with airstrikes. And that was the hardest blow that's been struck since the Gaza war in 2014. So sorry about the PowerPoint there, but what we're seeing currently in the area in Syria and all the conflict that's happening in Syria, but also extending into Lebanon, extending into the Gaza Strip, is that there's war being talked about on all of those fronts. And as we've talked about tonight, we expect that war will break out between Israel and the surrounding nations. So brothers and sisters, we are in a unique position. We have the truth of God's word. Let's not wait until we see Jesus appear in the heavens and then mourn our lost opportunity like the Jews in Zechariah chapter 12. Let's make the most of every opportunity that we have, focus on what is important, and build our faith so that we are ready and we are waiting when we see the sign of the Son of Man in the heavens. So thanks very much for your attention tonight.